A merchant in ancient China reaches into a leather pouch. She pulls out a handful of small, smooth shells. Cowries. Shiny, white, the size of an almond. She counts them carefully and hands them over. In return, she receives a bolt of silk. And here is the curious part. Thousands of kilometers away, on the coast of East Africa, another merchant does practically the same thing. Different language. Different culture. Same shell. How did the same little shell become money on opposite ends of the world? What did it have that made people trust it more than a promise or a favor? In the previous episodes, we saw why exchange is necessary, why barter fails, and how debts and gifts worked in small communities. But debts require knowing who owes what to whom. That works in a village of 100 people. It falls apart when a stranger shows up from 1,000 kilometers away. For that, you need something both of you can hold in your hands. Something whose value you can both accept. You need commodity money. This is episode 4 of part 1. So far, we have gone from specialization and exchange, through the problems of barter, to the gift economies and debt systems that actually preceded money. Today we take the next step. People began choosing specific things, real, physical commodities, and using them as money. Shells. Salt. Cattle. Grain. Cacao beans. Each one worked. For a while. In certain places. Under certain conditions. But each one also failed. And the failures are the interesting part. Because they reveal something fundamental about what money needs to be. By the end of this episode, you will understand 4 properties that any viable money must have. We are not going to start with the list. We are going to discover it, failure by failure. Pick up a cowrie shell. Feel it in your hand. Smooth. Cool. Pleasant to the touch. Now try to carve a copy out of wood or stone. You cannot. The natural shape of the shell is too intricate. That is one of the reasons it became one of the most successful forms of money in history. No king decreed it. No government backed it. People simply started using it because it worked. Cowries are small and uniform. They do not rot, rust, or crumble. They are virtually impossible to counterfeit. And they are beautiful. In China, during the Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, cowries were so central to economic life that the Chinese character for money still contains the radical for shell. Archaeologists have found cowries deposited in Shang dynasty tombs. Wealth for the afterlife. In India, cowries served as fractional currency for over 2,000 years. The Maldive Islands collected and exported them by the shipload, turning the archipelago into a kind of mint for half the ancient world. And across West Africa, cowries remained legal tender well into the 19th century. Long after Europeans had introduced metal coins. A single species of shell. 3 continents. 3,000 years. An impressive track record for something you can pick up on a beach. But there is a twist. Cowries had a fatal flaw. Their supply depended entirely on geography. If you lived far from the ocean, cowries were scarce and valuable. But if you lived near the Maldives, you could harvest them by the million. And when European traders began shipping massive quantities to West Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries, they flooded the market. Cowries did not just buy spices and textiles. They also bought people. They were one of the main currencies of the transatlantic slave trade. Prices collapsed. The money stopped being worth anything. Lesson 1: good money needs to be scarce. Not by geographic accident. Reliably, everywhere. You have probably heard this one. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The Latin word salarium, from sal, gave us the word salary. Therefore, salt was money. Great story. One problem: it is not quite true. The etymology is real. Salarium does come from sal. And while we are on etymologies, the Spanish word moneda and the English word money share a common origin. Both come from Juno Moneta, the Roman goddess in whose temple Rome's coins were struck. And salt was genuinely precious in the ancient world. Before refrigeration, it was the only way to preserve food. Rome even had a road named after it. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road. One of the oldest roads in Italy, built to transport salt from the coast to the interior. But here is the nuance that most versions skip. Roman soldiers were not literally handed sacks of salt on payday. They were paid in coins. Denarii. The salarium was most likely a monetary allowance to buy salt, or simply a general stipend whose name outlived its origin. Why does this myth matter? Because it reveals something true. Salt was so valuable that people associated it with wages. But it also shows how easily a good story can harden into bad history. Still, salt was used as commodity money in many places. In Ethiopia, bars of rock salt called amoli served as currency until the 20th century. In parts of Southeast Asia, salt cakes circulated for centuries. But think about salt as money for a moment. It dissolves in water. It is heavy relative to its value. And try making change. Splitting a salt bar into exact fractions is practically impossible. Lesson 2: Good money needs to be divisible. Precisely and reliably. Open the Iliad. Homer, 8th century BCE. Two warriors, Diomedes and Glaucus, exchange armor. The poet gives us the price. Diomedes' armor, 9 oxen. Glaucus' golden armor, 100 oxen. A bronze tripod, the prize at the funeral games of Patroclus, 12 oxen. Cattle were not just wealth. They were the measuring stick. The unit of account. And here is something that might surprise you. The Latin word for cattle is pecus. From it came pecunia, meaning money. Which gives us pecuniary. But wait. The word capitale originally meant head of cattle. It became capital. And chattel, meaning movable property in English? Same root. Our entire financial vocabulary was built on cows. Capital. Pecuniary. It all goes back to livestock. Cattle had real advantages as money. They were valuable. Everyone needed food, leather, and labor. They were relatively scarce. And an interesting bonus, they could reproduce. Your wealth could literally grow on its own. But cattle were terrible at 3 things. You cannot divide a cow. Half a cow is not money. It is meat that rots in a week. You cannot easily transport cattle over long distances. And cattle die. Disease, drought, old age. Your entire fortune could vanish in a single bad season. Lesson 3: Good money needs to be durable and portable. Cattle were neither. Imagine you are workers building the pyramids. Payday arrives. You do not receive coins. You receive grain. In ancient Egypt, wheat and barley were the backbone of the economy for millennia. Workers were paid in grain. Taxes were collected in grain. And in the granaries of the temples and the state, something extraordinary happened. You could deposit your grain and receive a receipt. Then you could hand that receipt to someone else as payment, without touching the physical grain at any point. Sound familiar? It should. It is basically how your bank works. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, from 305 to 30 BCE, this system reached remarkable sophistication. A centralized network of state granaries, headquartered in Alexandria, allowed depositors to transfer grain credits between regions. You could deposit grain in Thebes and authorize a payment in Memphis. One of the first money transfer systems. The grain stayed in a warehouse. What moved was the record of who owned it. Grain had real virtues. Almost everyone needed it. One bushel of wheat is much like another. And it could be divided into small amounts. But grain rots. Mice eat it. Floods destroy it. And it weighs enormously relative to its value. You could not carry enough grain on your back for a major purchase in a distant city. The Egyptian solution, leave the grain in place and move the paperwork, was brilliant. But it required a centralized authority that everyone trusted. When that authority weakened, the system fell apart. Here is a question. What if you could drink your money? In Mesoamerica, the Maya and later the Aztecs used cacao beans as currency. Analysis of nearly 180 pieces of Maya art shows cacao appearing as a medium of exchange from the 8th century onward. It was used for taxes, tribute, and everyday purchases. The Aztecs priced everything. A rabbit, 10 cacao beans. A turkey egg, 3. A tamale, 1. Cacao was portable, reasonably uniform, and widely desired. Both as currency and as the raw material for a priced chocolate drink that only the elites could afford. But cacao beans spoil. You can eat them. Which means every transaction carries a temptation, consuming your own money. And there is more. People counterfeited cacao beans. How? They hollowed them out and filled them with mud. A money you can eat. A money you can counterfeit by stuffing it with dirt. Clever, but fragile. Now let us step back. There is a pattern that has been staring us in the face. Every commodity we have examined succeeded in some respects and failed in others. And the failures are not random. They cluster around 4 properties. Durability. Money must withstand the passage of time. Cattle die. Grain rots. Cacao spoils. Salt dissolves. Cowries, interestingly, last for centuries. But even they crack and chip. Divisibility. Money must be breakable into smaller units without losing value. Grain divides easily. Cowries are counted one by one. But you cannot split a cow. And cutting a salt bar is pure guesswork. Portability. Money must be easy to transport relative to its value. Cowries are light but low in unit value. You would need whole sacks for a large purchase. Salt is heavy. Cattle walk, but slowly, and they do not cross oceans. Grain weighs a ton. Cacao is light but fragile. Scarcity. Money must have a limited supply, or it loses value. Cowries seemed scarce until traders flooded the market. Salt is abundant near the coast, rare inland. Cattle reproduce, but slowly. Grain can be grown by anyone with land. No commodity scored perfectly on all four properties. Every civilization chose the best option available. The commodity that scored highest given its geography, its climate, and its needs. But every choice was a compromise. These are not just historical curiosities. The four properties we have discovered, durability, divisibility, portability, scarcity, are still the criteria by which any form of money is judged today. When economists debate whether Bitcoin could work as money, they are asking the same questions that a Shang dynasty merchant asked about cowrie shells 3,000 years ago. Does it last? Can it be divided? Can it be transported? Is its supply limited? The commodities changed. The questions have not. And notice something else. Something profound. Each of these commodity monies emerged independently. In civilizations that had no contact with one another. The Maya never met the Chinese. The Egyptians never traded with the Aztecs. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia had no way of sharing the idea. And yet, they all converged on the same solution. Choose a commodity. Agree on its value. Use it to facilitate exchange. That convergence tells us something important. The need for money is not a cultural invention. It is a structural consequence of specialization and trade. Wherever humans specialize, wherever strangers need to exchange, money, in some form, emerges. 1. Commodity money equals using valuable goods as a medium of exchange. 2. Cowries, salt, cattle, grain, cacao each worked under specific conditions. 3. The salary and salt story, the etymology is real, the literal payment is a myth. 4. For properties of money, durability, divisibility, portability, scarcity. 5. No commodity scored perfectly, every choice was a compromise. 5 ideas to remember. 1. Commodity money is the bridge between informal exchange and formal currency. People chose real, valuable goods as their medium of exchange. 2. Cowrie shells were perhaps the most successful commodity money in history. 1 species. 3 continents. 3,000 years. 3. Roman soldiers were not paid in salt. The word salary does come from salt. But the literal payment is a myth. Good history requires nuance. 4. From these examples, 4 properties emerge. Effective money must be durable, divisible, portable, and scarce. 5. No commodity nailed all 4. Every civilization made trade-offs based on what was available. Shells break. Cattle die. Salt dissolves in the rain. People needed something more durable. More divisible. More portable. They found it underground. The next step in the history of money did not come from the ocean, or the field, or the herd. It came from the earth itself. Metals, silver, gold, copper, bronze had properties that no living or organic commodity could match. But metals brought their own problems. How do you know if a piece of silver is pure? How do you know if it weighs what the seller claims? That is next time.